In this episode, we are going to set up the TypeORM for our NestJS application with Postgres database. This is Sakura Dev channel, and welcome back to the NestJS full course where you can learn NestJS from zero to hero. In the first step, we need to create our Postgres database. We have two options for doing that. The first one is to create and set up our Postgres database inside a Docker container, and the second one, which is a new option for creating the Postgres databases, which is using serverless platforms. So in this course, we are going to stick to the second option, and for that we are going to use Neon for creating our Postgres database. So just click on the login here, and I'm going to use my Google account to log in. Okay, and here we just need to specify a name for our project. I'm going to go ahead with the NestJS course, and we need to specify a name for our database. I'm going to set it to real estate DB. Okay, and just need to create project, and that's it. We have created our Postgres database, and this is the URL of our Postgres database. So we're going to get back here and copy this URL and use it in our TypeORM configurations. So now let's go to our NestJS project and install the dependencies for setting up the TypeORM. So I open up the terminal, and here we're going to install three packages. The first one is at nestjs/TypeORM. The second is TypeORM itself, and the third one is the driver for our database. So here, since we are going to use Postgres, I just remove the MySQL here, and instead we're going to install the PG, which stands for Postgres. So let's install these three packages. Okay, it's done, and now we can go ahead and configure the TypeORM in the root module of our application, which is app.module.ts. So I go to the app module here, and let's zoom in. Here in the imports list of the app module, we need to add the TypeORM module. So here I just use TypeORM module, which comes from the nestjs/TypeORM, and then here we need to call a function which is for root. Okay, and then inside this function we need to pass our config object. So we can directly put the config object here, but let's just create the config object inside another file in our project. So here in the root path of our application, we're going to create a file, call it dbconfig.ts, and inside this file we're going to export an object. So here I'm going to say export const. I'm going to call the object pgconfig, and let's set the type for this object, which is Postgres connection options, which comes from the TypeORM/driver/Postgres and then /Postgres connection options. So now let's initialize the object. Inside this object, we need to specify the database, the host address, username, and also the password of your username inside your Postgres database. But instead of doing that, I just initialize the URL property for this object and set it to the URL that Neon platform gives us for our Postgres database. So let's get back to the Neon platform, and here let's just copy this URL, and here we're going to paste that for the URL property. And here I want to point out a very important thing here. We should put the URL of our Postgres database inside our env file. But since reading variables from env file inside NestJS is a little tricky, we're going to do that in the upcoming section of this course. So for now, let's just plainly put the URL of our Postgres database in the config.ts file, which, as I said, is not a good idea. And here let's put a comment. Don't put this here. Instead, put it in the env file. So now let's save this, and also we need to add another property to this config file. The second one is going to be the type, and it's going to be Postgres, and then we're going to set the port to 3306, which is the port of the Postgres database, and we need to set the entities list. For now, we just leave it empty because we haven't created any entities in our application yet. An entity is a class that will be mapped to a table inside our database. So instead of creating the tables in our database manually, we just create entity classes, and TypeORM will create our database schema with the entity classes that we are going to create in our application. So as I said, since we haven't created any entities in our application yet, we just leave this empty. Okay, and the next one, which is synchronize, we're going to set that to true. This option automatically updates our database schema based on our entity definitions. So it is a really great option in the development mode, but it is highly discouraged in the production. So in the production mode, we should set the synchronize to false, because for example, if you accidentally make changes to your entities, like removing a column, this synchronize true option will drop that column from your database, and that will lead to permanent data loss. So if you are on the production, make sure to set this synchronize to false. Okay, we're done with the config object, and now we can go back to our app module and here pass the pgconfig object into the for root function of the TypeORM module. So I just pass it to for root function here. Okay, so that's it for setting up the TypeORM in our NestJS application. Now in the next section, we are going to create our first entity, and you will see how it can be easily mapped to a table inside our Postgres database. In this section, we are going to create our first entity, which is going to be a real estate property entity. So here inside the src directory, we're going to create a directory. I'm going to call it entities, and then inside it, we're going to create a property.entity.ts file. So make sure that you put the .entity in your entities class. It's not mandatory, but it is better to include a .entity in the name of your entity files. I will show the reason for that at the end of this video. But for now, let's create our property entity. As I said, it is going to be a class. At the first step, we need to export a class from this file. We're going to name it property, and then in order to tell the TypeORM that it is a entity class, we need to mark it with the entity decorator. So here I just use the entity decorator here, and now it is a entity class and will be mapped to a table inside our database. And now we can define the fields for this entity. It is going to have an ID, which is going to be a number. Now, in order to tell the TypeORM to create a field inside the property table, we need to mark it with the @column decorator from the TypeORM. Now it is going to be a fields with name ID within our property table in our database. But since it is going to be a primary key in our database, we can use another decorator for that, which is primary column. And now this ID field is the primary key of the property table. And since we want it to be a auto increment ID, we can use another decorator, which is primary generated column. So I add generated column here. Now it is a primary key in our table, which is also a auto increment field. It means that when we are going to insert a new record into the property table, we don't need to specify the ID for that record. The database automatically will generate the ID value and put it inside the ID field of the new record. So that's why we mark it with the primary generated column. Now let's create another column for this entity. It is going to be name. Its type is going to be string. And now we need to mark it with the column decorator. So it is going to be a field inside our property table. Okay, now let's create another one, which is going to be description, and set its type to string, and also mark it with the column decorator. Okay, now let's create a price field, which this time the type is number, and we need to mark it with the column decorator. And now let's set the default value for this field inside our table. So we can pass in configuration object here, and inside that we can set the default property to a value that we want. So in this case, we're going to set it to 0. So if we don't specify any value for the price field when we are going to insert a new record in the property table, the database automatically puts 0 as a default value for this price field in our property table. Okay, so now let's save this, and we need to go to the dbconfig file here, and inside this entities list, now we need to include the property entity. So let's import that and put it here. Now let's run our server, npm run start dev. Now let's go to the Neon project. Here in the tables, you can see we have a property table with the fields ID, name, description, and the price. And here we go, we have created our first table in our database as easy as possible. Okay, so now let's do a recap here. First, we need to create our Postgres database and get a URL for our database. And then we need to install the dependencies for the TypeORM. Then we need to create a config file for our Postgres database. Here we need to set the URL to our Postgres URL. As I said, we need to put this URL in our env file. We'll talk about how we can do that in the upcoming sections of this course. But for now, let's just leave it inside our code. Then we need to set the type to Postgres, specify the port, and also specify the list of our entities that will create our database schema. Then we need to set the synchronize to true because it will automatically update our database schema based on our entities definitions. As I said, this must only be set to true in the development environment. In the production mode, you should set it to false. Then I go to our app module, our root module actually. We need to add the TypeORM module inside the imports list of our app module and then call the forward function and pass our pgconfig object that we have created inside our dbconfig file. Then we need to create our entities. An entity is just a class in which we are define the fields of our entity. That's it for configuring the TypeORM. And now let me show you a problem here. In our entities directory, let's say we have more than 20 entities. Then manually we need to add them inside the entities list of the pgconfig object. We have a better idea, and that's it. We can add our entities automatically in the entities list. So let me show you how we can add our entities automatically without hard coding them here inside this entity list. We can use the __dir name, which is a global variable which represents the absolute directory path of currently executing file. In other words, it just points out to the current directory of the current file. So from the current directory and inside any subdirectory, so I put a /2*, which means any subdirectory inside the current directory, and then any file inside it, which ends with an .entity and then end with .ts or .js. So it actually add any files inside any subdirectory of our current directory, which its name ends with .entity. So that's why we use .entity in our entity files, and then it ends with .ts or .js. So now any file with this pattern inside any subdirectory of our project will be automatically added to the entities list of our pgconfig file. So let's save this and open up our terminal. Let's stop the server and get back to the Neon. I just removed this table, click on the drop, then let's get back to the project and start the server again. Okay, now let's get back again to the Neon and let's refresh the page. You can see again we have the property table inside the tables list of our database. So with this pattern, we can automatically add your entities in your NestJS application. So yeah, that's it for this section. And in the next section, I'm going to talk about how we can do CRUD operations. And also I'm going to show you how we can create this database schema with all its table and all its relationships. You can see it has one-to-one relationships, one-to-many relationships, and also many-to-many relationships. So in the upcoming sections of this course, we will talk about how we can do CRUD operations with TypeORM and also create a real-world database schema with all its relationships with TypeORM in our NestJS project. And the good news here is that we're not only going to create this database schema with TypeORM, but also in this course we are going to create this database schema with Prisma and DrizzleORM, and then we are going to see how we can use this database with MongoDB and Mongoose in our NestJS application. So make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification so you don't miss the upcoming episodes of this course in which you are going to master working with databases with all types of available ORMs in NestJS. And also, if this video was helpful for you, please hit the like button. It will be icing on the cake for me and gives me more energy and create more episodes for this course. Okay, have a nice time and see you in the next episode. Bye bye.